There is a moment, and many people will recognize it immediately, when you look at your bank balance and feel a quiet unease that you cannot quite explain. The number is there, the money exists, you have not done anything reckless. You have paid your bills, avoided anything impulsive, and done the careful arithmetic of responsible living for as long as you can remember. And yet the number feels wrong. It feels smaller than it should, given the years you have put in and the care you have taken. You go to the grocery store and come home with 2 bags that cost what 4 bags used to. You open a utility bill and notice it has crept up again, not by some dramatic amount, but enough to pause. You plan a small trip, not an extravagant one, just the modest, quiet kind of trip that once felt completely manageable, and the cost gives you a moment of hesitation you did not expect. And somewhere in that hesitation, a thought crosses your mind that is difficult to say out loud. Did I do something wrong? Most people do not voice this at the dinner table. It stays private. It becomes part of the quiet background anxiety of daily life. The math between what you expected life to cost and what it is actually costing now. The gap between the future you prepared for and the one that arrived. This feeling has an official name. Economists call it the erosion of purchasing power. But that is a textbook phrase that says nothing about what it actually feels like to live it, year by year, decade by decade. What it actually feels like is quieter and harder. It is the slow realization that the same effort, the same discipline, the same amount of money, buys a little less than it used to. And that the gap seems to widen, not close. The first thing this conversation wants to say, clearly and without qualification, is this: you are not imagining it. And it is not your fault. That may sound like something you say to make people feel better. But it is actually a factual statement. The erosion of purchasing power is measurable. It can be tracked in official data, confirmed in real markets, studied across generations. It is not a perception problem. It is not a discipline problem. It is a structural reality, one that has been building slowly since the early 1970s, accelerating at certain moments, and one that has fallen disproportionately on people who had no easy way to protect themselves from it. Over the next 40 minutes or so, we are going to look carefully at where this comes from. How it built up quietly over decades. Why the official numbers do not tell the whole story. What it costs people emotionally. The private shame. The reluctance to talk about it. The loneliness of feeling like you are falling behind through no fault of your own. And what it reveals about a set of promises that an entire generation was given. About work, saving, and security. And how those promises quietly shifted. We are not going to solve inflation. No one conversation can do that, and anyone who offers a simple answer to a structural problem is probably selling something. But there is real value in understanding a problem clearly. Because when money feels smaller and you do not know why, the mind tends to fill the gap with shame. With the private sense that a more responsible person would have handled this better. That a wiser person would not be in this position. That story is wrong. And it matters that we say so clearly before we go any further. The people who feel this most acutely are often not the people who spent carelessly. They are the people who took the advice seriously, who lived below their means, avoided unnecessary debt, put money away when they could, and trusted that the rules of the game would stay roughly stable across their working lives. For many of them, the rules did not stay stable. And no one came to explain what had changed, or why, or who benefited from the change. There is a particular kind of financial difficulty that does not look like financial difficulty in the obvious sense. It does not look like bankruptcy or dramatic crisis. It looks like a quiet tightening. A year where you trim one small thing. Then another year where something else gets trimmed. Then another. The accumulation of small adjustments that each seem reasonable in isolation but that, taken together over a decade, add up to a life that is measurably narrower than the one you imagined. Many people in their 60s and 70s are living exactly this kind of quiet contraction. Some manage it with composure. Some carry real fear about it. Almost all do so without much public acknowledgement that the difficulty is real, that it is structural, and that it is not the product of irresponsibility. We want to change that, at least in this conversation. Because clarity, even when it does not offer solutions, has a value of its own. Understanding why the dollar feels smaller is not the same as making it larger. But it does something important. It removes the shame from the equation. And shame, it turns out, is one of the heavier things a person can carry quietly. So let us start at the beginning. Let us go back to how we got here. To understand why money feels smaller today than it did 30 or 40 years ago, we have to begin with a distinction that rarely gets explained clearly. The difference between what the official inflation number measures and what the actual cost of your life measures. In the United States, the primary measure of inflation is the Consumer Price Index. Most countries have their own version of the same idea. The basic concept is sensible enough. Track the prices of a basket of common goods and services over time and report how that basket changes. If the basket costs 2% more this year than last year, inflation is 2%. The problem is what goes into the basket, how it is weighted, and whose life that basket actually represents. The Consumer Price Index was designed to measure a broad, average experience of consumer prices. It includes housing, food, transportation, medical care, education, clothing, and a range of other categories. On the surface, that sounds comprehensive. But the devil is in the weighting. How much each category contributes to the overall number. For an older adult living on a fixed income, the basket of costs looks very different from the average. Healthcare is not a minor category that gets a modest weighting. It is one of the dominant expenses of later life, and it has been inflating at roughly twice the rate of general inflation for decades. Housing costs, whether rent, property tax, home insurance, or the cost of basic maintenance, are similarly weighted in ways that tend to understate what older homeowners actually experience. And food, particularly the staple groceries that make up the foundation of daily life, has seen inflation bursts in recent years that official averages tend to smooth over. The Bureau of Labor Statistics in the United States actually publishes a separate experimental index called the CPIE, the Consumer Price Index for the elderly. Studies of that index consistently show that older adults experience inflation at a higher rate than the headline number suggests. Not dramatically higher in most years, but meaningfully higher over time. A difference of 1% per year compounding over 20 years is not a rounding error. It is the quiet arithmetic of a life that costs more than the headline number told you it would. This matters for a specific and painful reason. Social Security cost of living adjustments, the annual increases in benefits, are tied to the General Consumer Price Index. Not the Elderly Index, not the Healthcare Index, the general average, which means that for the large number of Americans whose retirement income depends significantly on Social Security, their benefits have consistently adjusted for an inflation rate that understates what they actually experience. The gap is not enormous in any single year, but it is persistent, and persistent gaps compound. To understand how this happened, we have to go back further, back to the 1970s, which is when the modern relationship between inflation, wages, and purchasing power first fractured. The 1970s were defined by two major oil shocks that drove prices up sharply and simultaneously. The political and economic response, particularly in the United States and the United Kingdom, led to a dramatic shift in economic philosophy in the early 1980s. The priority became controlling inflation above almost everything else. Interest rates were raised to levels that broke the back of consumer price inflation but also restructured the economy in ways that few people fully understood at the time. What followed was a long era in which consumer price inflation stayed relatively low, a fact that was presented, reasonably enough, as success. But what was less discussed, and far less visible, was that asset prices, the prices of things like houses, stocks, and financial instruments, did not stay low. They rose significantly over the following decades, particularly in periods of low interest rates. And that divergence between consumer prices and asset prices created a structural division that reshaped who in society accumulated real security and who did not. People who owned assets, who owned homes before prices rose sharply, who held stocks and retirement accounts that grew with the market, found that their net worth expanded even when their wages stayed flat. People who did not own significant assets, who worked for wages without much accumulated wealth, and particularly people who were already retired and living on fixed incomes, found that the official calm of low inflation masked a real and persistent erosion in what their money could do. This is not a conspiracy. It was not designed by any particular villain. It was the emergent result of policy choices, market dynamics, and structural incentives that tended to reward ownership over labor and assets over income. But the consequences were very real, and they were not evenly distributed. And then, between 2020 and 2023, something happened that stripped the pretense away entirely. Consumer price inflation returned with a force that had not been seen in 4 decades. Groceries, gasoline, utilities, housing costs, the things that older adults on fixed incomes cannot avoid, all rose sharply. Official inflation peaked above 8% in the United States. The real experience for many older people was higher than that, because the things they spent the most on were the things rising fastest. Social Security received its largest cost of living adjustment in 40 years, 8.7% in 2023. That sounds reassuring until you calculate that grocery prices had risen more than that rental costs in many markets had risen far more than that, and that healthcare costs had not paused for the pandemic the way some other sectors had. And then, even as headline inflation came down from its peak, it did not come back to where prices were before. This is the part that confuses some people and frustrates almost everyone who lived through it. When inflation falls from 8% to 3%, prices do not fall. They are simply rising more slowly. Everything that became expensive during the surge stayed expensive. The new baseline held. That is what changed, not in one dramatic moment, but through the long, quiet accumulation of structural shifts that began 50 years ago and that accelerated in ways most people felt in their bones before they saw them in any official report. The economic history is important, but the history does not capture what it actually feels like to live this, the daily texture of a life that is slowly and quietly adjusting downward. Think about the way this tightening tends to happen. It does not usually arrive as a dramatic moment of crisis. It arrives as a series of small recalibrations, each of which seems manageable in the moment. The first year, you stop buying 1 or 2 things at the grocery store that were not quite necessities. A particular brand, a type of fruit, a small indulgence that you had bought so routinely that it never seemed like a decision until the day you put it back on the shelf and walked to the checkout without it. That day, you tell yourself it does not matter. It is just a small thing. The second year, you think more carefully about the heating. You read somewhere that each degree of adjustment makes a difference, and you try it. The house is slightly less warm than you prefer. You wear an extra layer. You adapt. This is fine, you tell yourself. People adapt. By the 5th year, you realize that you have made a dozen such adjustments and that each one seems small enough to accept without comment. But when you think about all of them together, the vacations that became shorter, the dinners out that became less frequent, the small pleasures that quietly dropped off the list, you begin to feel something that is harder to name than inconvenience. It is closer to loss. Not dramatic loss, not the kind of loss that arrives with a phone call in the night. Just the accumulation of small absences. Things that used to be available to you, not luxuries exactly, but the modest texture of a comfortable life, that are no longer quite within reach. And you are not sure when exactly that happened, or whether it is permanent, or whether it says something about you. This is where the emotional cost lives. Not in the numbers, but in the questions those numbers raise about who you are and what your life means. There is a particular pain in financial worry that arrives in later life. It is different from financial worry at 30 or 40, when there is still time to change course, to earn more, to make different decisions. In later life, the options are narrower. You cannot easily go back to work at the same level. You cannot easily restructure your savings. You are living with the consequences of decisions made decades ago, in a world that no longer quite exists. And because the worry arrives late, after a lifetime of trying to do things right, it carries a particular kind of shame. The shame of having failed at something you studied, something you planned for, something you thought you understood. Except you did not fail. The ground moved. The shame is compounded by the silence around it. Many older adults find it extremely difficult to talk about financial worry, with their children, with their friends, with anyone. There are several reasons for this. Partly it is generational. A generation raised on the belief that financial difficulty was a private matter, something to be managed quietly without burdening others. Partly it is pride. The pride of someone who worked hard their whole life and does not want to be seen as struggling. And partly it is fear. Fear of becoming dependent, fear of being a burden, fear that acknowledging the worry out loud will make it more real. So it stays internal. It becomes part of the background noise of daily life, the low hum of financial anxiety that colors ordinary decisions, that makes small purchases feel weightier than they should, that sits quietly behind conversations about the future. There is also something worth naming about the particular position of people on fixed incomes, people whose retirement income, whether from Social Security, a pension, or a fixed annuity, cannot grow in response to rising costs. For someone still working, a period of high inflation is painful, but it can theoretically be addressed. You can ask for a raise, take on extra hours, find a better paying position. For someone on a fixed income, those levers do not exist. The income is what it is. If costs rise faster than the income adjusts, the standard of living falls. There is no other variable. This is not a failure of planning. It is a feature of fixed income that becomes a liability when the environment changes faster than the income can track. And for millions of people who entered retirement believing that a fixed income would provide stability, the experience of inflation has revealed a vulnerability that was invisible when rates were low. The quiet erosion is also felt differently across different kinds of fixed incomes. A pension that was designed in 1985 may have been generous in 1985 terms. 40 years later, without adequate inflation adjustment built in, that same pension may feel like a fraction of what it was intended to provide. The number did not change. The world around it did. This is what the human cost of purchasing power erosion actually looks like. Not a headline, not a statistic. A person wearing an extra layer of clothing in their own home in October because the heating bill has made them cautious. A couple who has quietly stopped talking about the trip they used to take every few years, because the conversation has become too uncomfortable. An individual who sits alone with a small worry that feels disproportionate to their external circumstances, because they know, privately, that their margin has narrowed, and who does not know how to explain it to anyone without sounding like they are complaining. They are not complaining. They are describing something real. At the heart of this story is something that was never written down, never formally guaranteed, and yet was widely understood to be true. Call it a social contract, if you like, though that phrase has been used so often it has lost some of its weight. Call it a promise, or a deal, or simply a set of reasonable expectations. The deal went something like this. You work. You contribute to society through your labor and through the taxes you pay. You live carefully, avoid unnecessary debt, and put something aside for the future. You trust that the institutions around you, the government, the banking system, the currency itself, will maintain their end of the arrangement. That the money you save will retain its value. That the benefits you were promised will be there when you need them. That responsibility will be rewarded, even if not lavishly. This deal was never legally binding. It was cultural and structural, a set of expectations that emerged from a specific period in economic history, particularly the post-war decades from the 1940s through the early 1970s, when wages grew steadily, housing was accessible to working people, pensions were common, and the gap between a careful working-class life and a comfortable one was bridgeable with sustained effort. That world produced a generation, or parts of several generations, whose relationship with money was shaped by the belief that responsibility led to security. Not wealth, necessarily, not luxury, but security. The modest, reliable security of knowing that if you did the right things over a long working life, you would land in a place that was safe. What happened after the 1970s did not destroy that deal outright. It did not announce itself as a departure. It changed the terms slowly, in ways that were visible to economists and largely invisible to everyone else, until the consequences arrived. The most important change was the divergence between wages and productivity, the gap between what workers contributed to the economy and what they received in return. For most of the post-war period, these moved together roughly in parallel. As the economy grew more productive, wages rose to reflect that. Then, beginning in the early 1970s in the United States and slightly later in other Western countries, something changed. Productivity continued to rise. Wages did not keep pace. The gap, over 50 years, became enormous. Where did the value go? Largely to capital, to the owners of assets, to corporate profits, to shareholders. The rise of shareholder value capitalism in the 1980s explicitly prioritized returns to capital over wages. This was not universally bad. It produced enormous growth in asset values, which benefited people who owned assets. But it quietly shifted who in society accumulated real security. The generation that retired in the 1990s and early 2000s was, in many ways, the last generation to retire at scale with defined benefit pensions, the kind that provide a fixed income for life regardless of market conditions. For them, the deal more or less held. Not perfectly, but well enough. The transition from that world to a world of defined contribution plans, 401 kiloseconds, IRAs, personal retirement accounts where the individual bears the market risk, shifted the terms of retirement in ways that were not widely announced or debated. The new arrangement had benefits. It allowed people to accumulate more wealth if markets performed well. It gave workers more portability and flexibility. But it also transferred risk. The risk of a bad market sequence, the risk of living longer than expected, the risk of underestimating future costs, from institutions to individuals. And that transfer of risk fell most heavily on people without the financial sophistication or the resources to manage it well. There is also something worth reflecting on about the nature of money itself, not as an abstract concept, but as a social agreement. Currency works because people trust it. They trust that what they save today will retain some meaningful portion of its value tomorrow, next year, in 20 years. That trust is not guaranteed by any physical reality. It rests on confidence in institutions, central banks, governments, the stability of the financial system. When inflation rises sharply, that trust is tested. Not destroyed, usually, but strained. And for older adults who lived through the inflation of the 1970s, who remember what it felt like to watch prices spiral and savings shrink in real terms, the return of inflation after 2020 carried a particular psychological weight. It was not just inconvenient. It activated a memory of instability, of a time when the ground had moved before. What does it mean to feel that the money you saved cannot quite be trusted to hold its value? It means something more than a financial calculation. It touches something about safety, the basic, fundamental safety of knowing that your future is not completely at the mercy of forces beyond your control. When that safety is in question, the anxiety is not just about money. It is about the whole structure of how you plan to live. This is why financial worry in later life is so often disproportionate to the actual numbers. A person with a comfortable cushion may still lie awake with anxiety that feels unreasonable to outside observers. The anxiety is not irrational. It is a rational response to having experienced, or witnessed, or simply felt in their bones, that the rules can change. That the ground can move. That what seemed reliable can prove, over time, to be less so. Understanding this does not make the anxiety disappear. But it does something useful. It reframes it. The anxiety is not a symptom of neurosis or weakness. It is the mark of someone who has paid attention. We have spent a long time looking at something uncomfortable: the structural erosion of purchasing power. The gap between the promises made to a generation of careful savers and the reality that arrived. The quiet, private cost of living within that gap. It would be dishonest to end by offering solutions that do not exist. Inflation cannot be personally solved. The divergence between wage growth and asset growth cannot be reversed by individual decision-making. The structural vulnerabilities of fixed income retirement are real, and pretending otherwise does not help anyone. But there is something worth offering, which is this: clarity itself has a form of value that is easy to underestimate. When the dollar feels smaller and you do not understand why, the mind tends to reach for the explanation that is closest at hand. And the explanation that is closest at hand is usually, I must have done something wrong. I must have missed something. I must not have been careful enough, or smart enough, or forward-thinking enough. That story, once it takes hold, is corrosive. It does not just make you feel bad about the past. It makes you doubt your judgment about everything. It makes ordinary financial decisions feel loaded with risk. It makes you reluctant to talk about money with the people around you, because talking about it would mean admitting the story that you failed at something fundamental. Removing that story, not by pretending everything is fine, but by understanding what actually happened and why, is a real form of relief. It does not change the numbers, but it changes what the numbers mean. They stop being evidence of personal failure and become, instead, the mark of someone who tried to navigate a world that was harder than it appeared. And there is something worth holding onto in that. The effort was real. The responsibility was real. The discipline was real. These things did not produce the outcome that was promised, partly because the promises were not kept, and partly because the world changed in ways that no individual planning process could fully anticipate. That is not the same as failure. It is what it looks like to try to live carefully in a complicated and uncertain world. What does this mean practically? A few things are worth sitting with quietly. The first is about what actually holds value when money erodes. Money, ultimately, is a means, a way of accessing things that matter. When the means become less reliable, it is worth thinking clearly about what the things are. Time with people you love, health, as much as can be protected, knowledge and experience that cannot be inflated away, habits of simplicity that reduce exposure to the pressures of cost, the relationships that do not require money to sustain. None of this is a substitute for material security, and it would be condescending to suggest that it is. People need money. They need it for food, housing, healthcare, warmth. Financial anxiety about those real necessities is not something to be philosophized away. But for many people, some portion of the financial worry is not actually about whether the necessities will be covered. It is about the loss of the cushion, the comfortable margin that made life feel safe. And when that margin narrows, there is a grief in it that deserves acknowledgement. Grief is a reasonable response to loss. Even the loss of a financial margin. Even the loss of a sense of security that you believed you had earned. The second thing worth sitting with is the possibility that adaptation, when it is honest and chosen, is not the same as defeat. There is a difference between being forced to tighten your life under the weight of shame and choosing to live more simply with clarity and purpose. One is experienced as diminishment. The other can be experienced as a different kind of freedom. Freedom from the pressure of maintaining a standard that no longer fits the reality around you. Many people who have navigated financial constraint in later life with dignity and equanimity have described something similar. A point at which they stopped measuring their life against what it was supposed to be and started measuring it against what it actually was. That shift does not eliminate difficulty, but it changes the emotional quality of living within it. The third thing is about the value of speaking. The financial anxiety of later life stays quiet partly because of shame, and that silence makes it lonelier and heavier than it needs to be. It is worth saying, at least to the people closest to you, that the money is tighter than you expected. That prices have changed things. That the margin is smaller. Not as a complaint, not to burden anyone, but as an honest acknowledgement of reality. Because the people who love you generally prefer honesty to performance. They would rather know than be kept outside of something you are carrying alone. The dollar feels smaller because it is smaller. In real terms, adjusted for what life actually costs, the same dollar buys less than it did 20 years ago. That is not your imagination. It is not a failure of will or discipline or foresight. It is the shape of the world you are living in. And understanding that shape, clearly, without shame, without either panic or denial, is where honest living in the second half of life has to begin. Perhaps the quiet wisdom is not to pretend the math has not changed. It has. The challenge is to understand the change clearly enough that it does not make you feel invisible, foolish, or alone. Because you are none of those things. You simply paid attention, and the world turned out to be more complicated than it promised.